of privileges?
None.
Other business? Private member motions? Private member motion number 3 of 2021-2022. Motion on allowing background music in bars on Sundays to be moved by the elected member for West Red Bay.
I recognize the member from Red Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe it bears noting that the House has enjoyed the longest lunch break I can recall in almost 22 years here. We've been on lunch now for 4.5 hours. Mr. Speaker.
Well, airport all be full now then.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move private members motion number 3 of the 2021-2022 session, entitled Motion on Allowing Background Music in Bars on Sundays.
So ordered, the minister needs to read the motion. Sorry, the member needs to read the motion.
Whereas the COVID-19 pandemic has caused an economic downturn and economic hardships across the globe, including in the Cayman Islands, where the estimated contraction in real gross domestic product in 2020 was 6.7%. And whereas the cost of imported goods and fuel has not only increased significantly over the past year, but is expected to rise further due to the impact of the pandemic and related issues, as well as because of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And whereas standalone bars, which are Caymanian-owned, like many small businesses, are still struggling to recoup the losses over the last few years of the pandemic. And whereas standalone bars are not currently allowed under the law to play background music on Sundays. And whereas Caymanian business owners of standalone bars are reporting a loss of business on Sundays to bars at establishments such as hotels and restaurants that are allowed under the Music and Dancing Control Act to have suitable background music being played. Be it therefore resolved that the government consider amending the Music and Dancing Control Act to include licensed bars as premises that are allowed to play background music to be enjoyed by patrons on a Sunday, provided the music should not be heard outside the boundary of the establishment.
Is there a seconder? The member for Georgetown South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to second the motion brought by the member for Red Bay.
Private member's motion number 3 has been moved and is now open for debate. Does the member wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fairly briefly, because I believe the motion is self-explanatory, I would just like, Mr. Speaker, to take you through and the House through the provisions of the current provisions of the Music and Dancing Control Act 2019 revision. Mr. Speaker, the law proceeds on the premise that music and dancing are not permitted on licensed premises on Good Friday, Christmas Day, or Sunday. This is Section 3 of the Act. But then it goes on in subsection 2 of the Act to provide a number of carve-outs or exceptions to that general rule. So subsection 2 of Section 3 provides that notwithstanding subsection 1C, which is the provision barring the playing of music on Good Friday, Christmas Day, or Sunday, music may be played or dancing permitted on Sunday, Good Friday, and Christmas Day at the airport or port areas as defined in the Port Authority Act 1999 revision, in order to welcome arriving passengers. And this is the crucial bit for the purposes of this motion, Mr. Speaker, or in a restaurant or hotel, being premises subject to this act, provided the following conditions are observed. A, the music is not played in excess of the prescribed noise levels, of which there are none currently. And B, the time during which it is played shall be between the hours of 9 a.m. and 11:45 p.m. So, Mr. Speaker, I am not sure, because this provision tracks back in previous versions of this law, of this act, what the rationale was at the time for not permitting music to be played in standalone bars. I don't know what the reason was at the time, but Mr. Speaker, it now is a complete incongruity, because we have a situation where, in particular, the bars and restaurants along the 7 Mile Strip are allowed to play music and to have dancing on Good Friday, Christmas Day, or Sunday. But we have a situation where local bars, which are all, without exception, Caymanian owned, are not allowed to have even background music on a Sunday. And it is causing a great deal of loss of business to those establishments, and indeed complaints from their patrons. Because, for instance, you're not allowed to have music at, say, Country and Western on a Sunday evening, but you can get in your car and go on the West Bay Beach, and any bar or restaurant there are able to have music. And so, Mr. Speaker, there is no, as I can see, there is no underlying premise for having the distinction between standalone bars and restaurants or hotels. The only one I could consider would be that the music, or the noise, as some people would call it, might cause inconvenience or distress to people who are not within the establishment. But that, Mr. Speaker, would be the case any day of the week, not just Sunday. There are many people in this country who worship on days other than Sunday. But in the motion, Mr. Speaker, I have been careful to say that I wish the House to resolve that there's a caveat or a proviso if the government does agree with amending the Music and Dancing Control Act as the motion prays, that the proviso would be that music should not be heard outside the boundary of the establishment, and thus the only people who would listen or be forced to hear the music would be those who have voluntarily gone to that particular establishment. And, Mr. Speaker, I know that there are those who have said and will say that they shouldn't be there in the first place. They should go to church on Sunday. And that, Mr. Speaker, may be the case. But these are licensed establishments, and this is still a very free country where people are allowed within the law to exercise free will. And I doubt, Mr. Speaker, that anyone who turns up at a licensed establishment, a liquor license establishment, on a Sunday or Sunday evening, that they had any intention in the first place of going to church. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone to the bar. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope that explains the rationale and the objective or the mischief that the motion seeks to cure. And, Mr. Speaker, without more, I ask the House for their support for the motion.
Does any other member wish to speak? the Honorable Minister of Financial Services and Commerce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to thank the member for Red Bay and the member for Georgetown South who seconded for putting forward this motion and providing the opportunity to discuss an issue that I think impacts local businesses as well as residents. As stated in Section 9 of the Plans and Estimates and Legislative Measures for 2022 and 2023, the government identified the Music and Dancing Control Act as a number of pieces of legislation is committed to modernizing during this budget cycle. And I can confirm that this remains the case. According to figures provided by the Department of Commerce and Investment, there are currently 58 licensed standalone bars. And as pointed out, the legislation in its current form puts them at a disadvantage as compared to restaurants and hotels due to their inability to play music for their patrons on Sunday. I was very interested in listening to the member from Red Bay, because when this issue was first identified, when we were preparing budget documents, and I examined the Music and Dancing Control Act, I struggled to comprehend what the rationale could have been. I drew out a few scenarios and looked at the historic revisions for the last 5 to 8 years, and there has seemingly been a piecemeal approach in which this issue remained, and I couldn't think of a logical reason why it was left. So I was very heartened to hear that there wasn't anything that the government had missed, that there doesn't seem to be any true rationale, and it's some disparity that's probably a hangover. So rather than embarking on another piecemeal approach, our intention is to take a more comprehensive look at the issue, which is why we're trying to do this in a reasonable time frame, because you not only have to take the standalone bar owners into account, you do have to take in consultation from the stakeholders. In addition to that, the other missing portion in the legislation, which should probably feature in secondary legislation, is how you measure the noise to ensure it doesn't disturb the neighbor, and whether there needs to be decimal levels raised in regulation so you can measure. So if the department goes out, you don't have an argument between a corresponding owner and a bar owner as to what is too loud. So those things can't just be done sort of off the cuff by an officer. There needs to be some level of measurement, and each bar should have one. So with that in mind, we're taking a comprehensive look, and in addition, trying to modernize other areas that surround this legislation to take that forward so that we're not here a few years later and it still not has been addressed comprehensively. But in short, we support the motion, and we're working on the cause in any event, and still are. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? I'll call now on the mover for his right of reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to say, but I am afraid to say, thanks to the Minister for his response, and certainly thanks for saying that the government will support the motion. But what gives me great pause is the last few sentences of the Minister's speech. Mr. Speaker, the Minister is new to this House, but those of us who've been here for some time know that it is at least 20 years that government after government has been trying to get the administrative arm of government to find a way to measure noise outside, the decibel levels of noise outside anywhere. And I fear that if that approach is adopted again, we're going to continue with this disparity and inequality that because there are no prescribed noise levels, right, in Cayman, period. So the restaurants and the hotels will continue to be able to, not just Sunday, this applies to in terms of noise as a nuisance, it's every day, that they will continue to be able to do what they have been doing and are still doing. But the local bars, the 58 of them, I'm surprised it's that many, are going to continue to suffer for the loss of business when the fix for this particular matter is simply the insertion of standalone bars into the section so that all liquor license establishments enjoy the same privileges. Now, Mr. Speaker, the reason why this has continued for so many years without any real fuss, and this is still a mystery to me, what's happened since this administration took office, because it's happened since then, is that this provision was honored more in the breach than in the observance thereof. So no one paid any attention as long as the noise wasn't troublesome to neighbors and no one complained. The bars just carried on business as usual. The jukebox was playing, or DJ was playing, or however they were having music played on Sundays, and nobody said anything. But in the last few months, I'm reliably told, the police were instructed to enforce this particular provision with respect to standalone bars. And police have made the rounds doing just that, warning proprietors not to have music played, proprietors of standalone bars on a Sunday. I have actually been there in an establishment when the police came in. So something has occurred. Somebody, somewhere, has said to the police, you need to enforce this provision. And that's why it has become problematic now. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is going to continue to be a very irksome and unfair situation, in particular as these are all Caymanian-owned establishments, if this is not dealt with swiftly. And so therefore, I am fearful when I hear the minister say that this is going to require a complete overhaul of the legislation, for I know too well that he may demit office before that is completed. That's just the way these things work. Unless somebody says this is a matter of real priority, it's going to join the long list of pieces of legislation that need amending or new legislation that needs to be drafted. And the resources of the government in relation to legal drafting are limited. I know only too well. So, Mr. Speaker, I am grateful for the indication the government is going to support the motion, but I am truly disappointed if the approach is going to be that which the minister outlined. And I would urge him and the government to give that particular aspect a rethink. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question is, be it therefore resolved that the government consider amending the Music and Dancing Control Act to include licensed bars as premises that are allowed to play background music to be enjoyed by patrons on a Sunday, provided the music should not be heard outside the boundary of the establishment. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. Private member's motion number 3 is passed.
Private Amendment Motion Number 4 of 2021-2022, motion on increased assistance to Caymanian home buyers, to be moved by the elected member for Georgetown West.
The member for Georgetown West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to move motion number 4, 2021-2022, titled Increase Assistance to Caymanian Home Buyers.
Is there a, can you read the motion, please?
Whereas the rising cost of land and home ownership has made it increasingly challenging for young Caymanians looking to build or purchase their first home. And whereas the COVID-19 pandemic has made obtaining a home even more difficult given the economic downturn and the disruptions to the global supply chain that has increased the cost of imported goods, including building supplies. And whereas all the above pressures on housing costs and the cost of living in general has been exacerbated by the Russian-Ukrainian war, which is further driving up the cost of goods. And whereas the USA experienced an 8.5 inflation rate in March 2022, a 41-year high, with Cayman's domestic overall inflation rising by 7.6% over 2021, but with the housing and utilities component rising by 11.5% and expected to climb higher in 2022. And whereas, in response to inflationary pressures, the U.S. Federal Reserve and the Bank of England have begun increasing interest rates, thus impacting interest rates in Cayman, which will make the cost of loans and mortgages and thus home ownership even higher for young Caymanians. And whereas the Cayman Islands government has announced a record budget surplus of some $221 million as of March 2022, which includes an effective windfall of $18.6 million, more than was initially budgeted. A windfall that should allow government to reduce stamp duty to Caymanians in a meaningful way, especially for housing. Be it therefore resolved that the government consider as a matter of urgency amending the Stamp Duty Act as follows. For first-time Caymanian property home buyers, A, 0% duty on land only with a value of up to $200,000, and for houses, apartments, or other dwelling purchases with a market value of up to $500,000 for owner occupation. And B, 2% duty on the value above $200,000 on land purchases, and for houses, apartments, or other dwellings purchased for owner occupation on the value above $500,000. C, in cases where the property is transferred to 2 or not more than 10 persons who are first-time Caymanian homeowners. 0% duty for bare land purchases with a market value of up to $350,000, and houses, apartments, or other dwelling purchases with a market value of up to $600,000 for owner occupation, and 2% duty on the value above $350,000 on raw land purchases, and for houses, apartments, or other dwellings purchased for owner occupation on the value above $600,000. For property purchased by a Caymanian that does not fall into the first-time Caymanian property home buyer scheme, 5% stamp duty for Caymanian persons only.
Is there a seconder? The member for Georgetown South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to second the motion brought by the member for Georgetown West.
Question is, be therefore resolved that the government consider as a matter of urgency amending the Stamp Duty Act as follows. For first-time Caymanian property home buyers, 0% duty on land only with a value of up to $200,000, and for houses, apartments, or other dwelling purchases with a market value of up to $500,000 for owner occupation, and B, 2% duty on the value above $200,000 on land purchases, and for houses, apartments, or other dwellings purchased for owner occupation on the value above $500,000. In cases where the property, in cases where the property is transferred to two or not more than 10 persons who are first-time Caymanian owners, small one, 0% duty for bare land purchases with a market value of up to $350,000, and houses, apartments, or other dwelling purchases with a market value of up to $600,000 for owner occupation, and 2% duty on the value above $350,000 on raw land purchases, and for houses, apartments, or other dwellings purchased for owner occupation on the value above $600,000. For property purchased by a Caymanian that does not fall into the first-time Caymanian property or home buyers scheme, the 5% stamp duty for Caymanian persons only. Either I'm getting old or this rating is too small. Does the mover wish now to speak to his motion?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe every member of the House will want to vote for this motion today, as it aims to provide practical support to Caymanians who are currently facing extraordinarily challenging financial circumstances. The unanimous approval of this motion will be an important signal that whatever other political differences we have, members of this House are willing to come together to push forward changes that can help to make a real difference for Caymanians who need our help. The motion seeks to reduce the burden of stamp duty on all Caymanians and also to provide increased assistance to Caymanians looking to buy their first home. I will speak to the substance of the proposed changes shortly. However, first, Mr. Speaker, I want to put this issue in context. As the text of the motion before the House sets out, Cayman is facing a cost of living crisis. Prices are going up on just about everything we buy. We are having to pay more for the electricity we use in our homes, more for the gas we put in our cars, and more for the groceries we buy in the stores. These are not luxuries, but represent everyday spending on those items we need just to get by. At the same time, we know wages in the wider economy are not rising at anything like the same rate, if at all. Therefore, real wages are falling and incomes are getting squeezed as prices spiral. Mr. Speaker, I am sure that, like me, every member here today will have spoken to hard-pressed constituents who are finding it increasingly difficult to get by in these circumstances. Like me, I am sure members across the House will have done what they can do to try to help those constituents, and I am sure we will continue to do so as the cost of living crisis deepens in the months ahead. Helping individual constituents in need is one of the things we do as members of Parliament. And that is a vital role, Mr. Speaker. But we also have a duty to look systematically at the problems facing our people and to design and implement solutions to those problems. And it is my purpose here today to encourage the House to approve this motion, which urges the government to take urgent action that will at least provide some relief in the current cost of living crisis facing our people. At this point, Mr. Speaker, I want to make one thing really clear. Neither I nor any of my colleagues on the opposition benches are seeking to lay the blame for the cost of living crisis at the door of the PAC administration. As the text of the motion makes clear, this is a global issue. As the pandemic eased and economic activity rebounded, a number of inflationary pressures emerged. Demand for fuel prices rapidly increased, driving up the cost of oil and gas, which then had knock-on effects across all sectors. Prices throughout the economy began to rise. Global supply chains were disrupted, and production was impacted at the same time as consumer demand strengthened, with people looking to spend money that they had saved during periods of restriction and the stimulus checks many had received from anxious governments, notably in the US. Increased demand and stuttering supply began to increase the upward pressure on prices. A potentially disastrous inflationary spiral had begun. Many of those pressures in the global economy remain, and now we also have to contend with the additional issues created by the war in Ukraine. The conflict is a tragedy in human terms. And Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that every member of the House will join me in praying for a swift end to the fighting and for the return of lasting peace. But sadly, the human story of the war extends beyond those immediately caught up in the conflict. Ukraine and Russia are both major wheat producers and exporters. The holdups to food supply as a result of the conflict are directly affecting their customers, including in some of the poorest countries of the world, but also inevitably impacting wider global markets. Other food supplies and, of course, oil and gas markets are also being impacted by both the conflict itself and the consequences of sanctions imposed on Russia and Belarus. In response to these inflationary pressures, central banks are raising interest rates. While their objective is to dampen consumer demand, the impact is directly felt as interest rate hikes push up mortgage rates and repayments are increased. A global crisis then, Mr. Speaker, but with profound impacts here in Cayman. The latest Consumer Price Index data released by the Economics and Statistics Office at the end of March showed that inflation here in Cayman was running at 7.6% at the end of 2021. Some of the more detailed data in the ESO's reports show the eye-watering increases in costs that Caymanian families are facing. Fuel costs up by 27.6%, electricity by 26.5%, and the cost of housing up by 10.7%. Mr. Speaker, the inflation numbers just mentioned were the position known to us when we drafted the motion. But as the motion states, it is certainly expected that inflation was to climb even higher over 2022. So it was no surprise yesterday when we received the update from the ESO on the Consumer Price Index to learn that in March of this year, the Consumer Price Index increased by 11.2% in the first quarter of 2022 when compared to the same period in 2021. The release goes on to state that all 12 CPI divisions recorded increases in average prices, with the main driver being the housing and utilities, which is now at 20.1%. To recap, in December 2021, the overall inflation rate was at 7.6%, with the housing and utilities section standing at 11.5%. A mere 3 months later, overall inflation moved upwards to 11.2%, with the housing and utilities component at 20.1%. So it's obvious, Mr. Speaker, that inflationary pressures have not gone away since the end of 2021 and is worsening. And all the forecasts suggest that global inflation is yet to peak and will persist for many months ahead. That is why I have described it as a cost of living crisis, Mr. Speaker. Families across our islands are struggling to meet these rising prices, particularly as, for example, those in our tourism industry have not seen their livelihoods fully restored as yet. As I have said, this is not a crisis of the government's making. No one is blaming them for the rise in prices. However, they will be held to account for how they respond to the crisis that our people are facing. Government must now be looking at taking whatever measures it can to help to lessen the impact of sharply rising prices, and people are rightly expecting them to take action. My motion today proposes one such action that can be taken immediately. Is it enough to deal with the cost of living crisis? Of course not. But it does provide a measure of meaningful assistance that can make a real difference. In thinking about what measure I could bring forward to the House, Mr. Speaker, I reflected on my own experience as a member of the last progressive-led administration. During that administration's term, the country faced inflationary pressures. And I recall the debates at caucus over how we might respond. The inflation we faced was nothing like the crisis this administration needs to confront. And we also had the benefits of the healthy and sustained growth with our administration, which our administration had enabled, that supported increased employment and income growth, so lessening the impact of rising prices for most households. However, even then it was clear that something needed to be done. And I recall, Mr. Speaker, the then Minister of Finance, now leader of the opposition, explaining to us that there are relatively few levers available to a small island government facing imported inflation. We had already made duty reductions such as the CUC fuel duty cut that directly reduced the cost of electricity to households and businesses. We held fast our pledge to not increase government fees and duty so as not to add to increasing costs. So we focus our attention on housing, in part because it was an area of particular cost pressure impacting Caymanians, but also because it was an area where we could make an immediate difference. We acted to reduce significantly the stamp duty costs that were adding to the burdens of first-time Caymanian homebuyers seeking to purchase property or land on which they could build their family a home. At the start of 2019, the threshold for the zero rate of stamp duty was increased for Caymanians seeking to buy their first home from $300,000 to $400,000, and the 2% stamp duty band was raised to cover properties valued between $400,000 and $500,000. For Caymanians looking to build their own home, the zero stamp duty threshold was raised to include land value at under $150,000, with a corresponding increase in the 2% rate for the land valued at $150,000 to $200,000. Mr. Speaker, the implementation of that policy initiative was one of the major successes of the last Progressives-led administration. In all of our constituencies, there are young families who now own their own home, having benefited from the duty reductions that the Progressives-led administration put in place. And of course, Mr. Speaker, at the election last year, the Progressives proposed a radical new approach to housing policy, bringing a new cross-government approach to the question of affordable housing. We promised to implement a number of further initiatives to support Caymanian families to buy their own homes, and we also recognized that there was more that we needed to do, not least to tackle the question of affordable rents. That election is over, Mr. Speaker. It now falls to the PAC government to bring forward changes that it believes can support Caymanians in the housing market. As ever, Mr. Speaker, in the absence so far of any meaningful proposals from the government, we on the opposition benches are willing to show them the way. Progressives still believe that far-reaching changes are needed to tackle both the home ownership and rental market. However, such reforms will need time, and we cannot let the great be the enemy of the good. So, faced with the immediate problem of the cost of living crisis, we need to take immediate action wherever that is possible. My motion, therefore, seeks to implore the government to take such immediate action by building on the successful approach taken by the last Progressives-led government. The 4 parts of the motion propose extending the range of assistance provided through the first-time Caymanian Property Homeowner Scheme and providing general relief to all Caymanians through a cut in the headline stamp duty rate they pay. The first section in my motion, paragraph A, urges the government to further raise the duty zero rate thresholds for first-time Caymanian home buyers by $100,000 for house purchases and $50,000 in respect of land purchases. The result of the change would be to exempt first-time Caymanian homebuyers from paying any stamp duty for houses with a value up to $500,000. The second provision would be to remove the top threshold for the 2% to be paid on purchases where the market value exceeds the zero rate threshold cap. The result of this change would be to ensure that no first-time Caymanian homebuyer pays more than 2% stamp duty, whatever the price of their home. The third provision in the motion, paragraph C, makes the necessary corresponding adjustments to the threshold for joint buyers. These are all important and significant concessions that the government can make to help first-time Caymanian home buyers. They would make a real difference, and at a time of high and spiraling inflation, the measures I am proposing would be the first step in helping to bring costs under more control. But we also need to recognize that the current crisis is not just being felt by young Caymanians looking to buy or build a property. Everyone is suffering from the ravages of inflation. So there is a duty on us to consider how we might broaden the help available. In the case of the housing market, there are particular dangers. Inflation in material costs and construction impact the cost of new homes, and rising interest rates are impacting mortgage repayments. Even in Cayman, the housing market is not immune to those pressures. A change to stamp duty to reduce costs for all will therefore bring benefits to Caymanians and help to incentivize transactions even when the market may grow more difficult as growth slows. The final part of my motion therefore proposes that the government should consider reducing the general rate of stamp duty paid by Caymanians from 7.5% to 5%. For the avoidance of doubt, the motion makes it clear that the existing rate would continue to apply to property purchased by non-Caymanian persons. Mr. Speaker, I accept that this is a major policy change and likely to be more controversial than the changes I'm proposing in respect of first-time buyers. Perhaps the most obvious objection to the proposal is the likely cost in terms of the impact on the revenues foregone by the government if it enacts such a policy. So let me deal with that head on, Mr. Speaker. There are three reasons why the impact might not be as severe as it first appears. First, currently, demand for property is still strong and prices are rising. Government revenues from stamp duty will rise accordingly as they take a fixed percentage of higher prices. Overall, stamp duty receipts are therefore likely to remain buoyant. Secondly, as the Financial Secretary told the Public Accounts Committee last week, there is in any case systematic underestimating of government revenues built into the budget-making process. Not least for the reason I have just indicated, stamp duty has consistently been one of those revenue streams to outperform its expected budgeted level. Without the changes proposed in my motion, we could anticipate that it will do so again this year. For these reasons, we might expect that government would have room for maneuver without impacting its current budget. However, if the fear is that such room for maneuver would be more than swallowed up, then we need to look no further than the government's own verdict on its financial performance to judge whether the changes I am proposing are affordable. This leads me on to the third reason. Government has announced there is $18.6 million better than forecast level of surplus for the first quarter of 2022, which could be used to offset the cost of my proposal. As reflected in the text of my motion, just last month, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance reported the government's financial results for the first quarter of 2022. Those results showed a surplus of $221 million for core government, which was some $18.6 million better than forecast. The Minister of Finance informed us that this surplus was the result of both better than expected receipts from duties and fees and the control that he believes is being exercised on spending by himself and his PAC colleagues. The excess income is already in the bank, and if we take the minister at his word, there is no reason to expect the expenditure savings to disappear in a blaze of reckless spending by his ministerial colleagues. The $18.6 million better than forecast levels of surplus therefore represents a windfall that could offset the cost of implementing my motion should that prove necessary. The arguments for this motion therefore become overwhelming. Mr. Speaker, no one can doubt the problems that the cost of living crisis is having and will continue to have on Caymanian families. It is beholden on government to do everything it can to reduce costs for Caymanians. The proposals I have put before the House are far from a complete answer, and I will be looking to ministers opposite to bring forward other measures that might benefit our people in the weeks ahead. However, my proposals to reduce the burdens on Caymanians created by the current stamp duty regime represent a sensible first step that the government can and should take. The changes are practical and they are deliverable immediately. They would help not only first-time buyers, but Caymanians more generally. And the package I have put forward can be seen to be affordable given the government's latest view of its financial position. On that basis, let us come together and by passing this motion demonstrate that this House is willing to respond swiftly and positively to the cost of living crisis that is facing our people. And the House having passed it, I hope the government will show urgency in implementing the policy changes we are asking of them. Mr. Speaker, I commend the motion to the House and ask honorable members to give their unanimous support today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable Deputy Premier and Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier today, when I was delivering the unaudited quarterly financial statements for the first quarter, I made reference to Frost's poem, "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but we have promises to keep and miles to go before we sleep, and miles to go before we sleep." Mr. Speaker, when this motion first popped up and we discussed it in caucus, as a matter of principle, Mr. Speaker, I had to support the motion. And my reasons for supporting the motion off the bat are twofold. One, except for the last two motions I brought when I was in opposition, every single motion I brought to the House, the government supported. So, as a matter of principle, Mr. Speaker, I have to extend the same courtesy that was given to me. And the member for Georgetown West, I think this probably may be his first motion in opposition. There is no way I am going to be part of someone's legislative record in this kind of environment. So I feel almost a sense to support the motion off the bat. The second reason, Mr. Speaker, is as a matter of principle, and maybe it was just a luck of the draw, that every single time one of my constituents needed support during the last government in terms of stamp duty, I always had the luck where the member for Georgetown South was always acting finance minister, and she exercised that discretion. Even if I didn't get the full amount, she always gave back something to help my constituent. And I want to publicly thank her for always, one, taking my calls when she was acting, and two, going above and beyond to really help them, because we do recognize that a lot of families do need help long before even this global pandemic. So I want to go on record for thanking her for that. Mr. Speaker, the member for Georgetown West referred to the promises made during the campaign. I challenge any member of this House that when it came on to stamp duty, that nobody, and someone have to come really good, had a more radical approach than I did. I actually campaigned, Mr. Speaker, that the first 3 properties, regardless of value, be stamp duty free. As a matter of fact, that's one of my videos that actually had probably one of the most views. So when it come on to being radical and understanding the approach, I think in terms of what it is that I ran on, and what I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that since taking office and this government taking office, and as the Minister of Finance, who is by law the Commissioner for Stamp Duty, I can tell you that this government has also gone above and beyond in terms of helping families. Since taking office, Mr. Speaker, we have assisted 246 families to the tune of almost $4.4 million in stamp duty already being waived since taking office. So this is something I deal with almost on a daily basis when you look at 246 applications. So, Mr. Speaker, I look back at our strategic policy statement that was delivered by our Honorable Premier and myself almost a year ago. And in particular, Mr. Speaker, I want to look at broad outcome number 3. And broad outcome number 3, Mr. Speaker, and the headline for that one is providing solutions to improve the well-being of our people so that they can achieve their full potential. And while items 1 dealt with support the family systems and communities, item 2 was create safer communities, item 3 was create a more modern social infrastructure. The one I want to talk about, Mr. Speaker, is actually item number 4, a broad outcome number 3, with the headline, provide adequate and affordable housing in our communities. And the 4 initiatives that are highlighted, Mr. Speaker, under that category is A, government guaranteed home assisted mortgages, B, provision of quality affordable housing, C, lower cost of borrowing through CIDB programs, and D, reduce stamp duty on land for Caymanians. So again, Mr. Speaker, as I said, accepting this motion would not be a challenge for this government. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the member may be pleased to note, or may be pleased or happy to know, that back in March of this year, the Cabinet created an inter-ministerial committee to actually deal with the housing issue in Cayman. And that committee is to be chaired by the Honorable Premier. It includes myself as Minister of Finance, who also have responsibility for CIDB. It also includes the Minister of Land, the Minister of Housing, and also the Minister of Transport. So, Mr. Speaker, steps and initiatives are already on the way. And why I say that the member would be pleased, Mr. Speaker, that the government will have no problem actually accepting these is that our preliminary results in terms of where we are in the studies that we have, what he's actually asking for is actually less, seriously less than what it is that the government will actually be bringing into the force. So the 200,000 for first time 0%, Mr. Speaker, for what the government will be proposing, 200,000, we consider that not to be enough. And again, like I said, I campaigned on the first 3 properties, regardless of value, being stamp duty free. And I can tell you, as a Minister of Finance, that the number, when this government finishes or that committee finishes work, is definitely going to be above the 200,000 mark. Equally, the 500,000 that they're talking about in property is already going to be above that. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, just recently, the CIDB, the Cayman Islands Development Bank, which I also have constitutional responsibility for, actually increased the limit in which you can actually borrow to 600,000. So I can say to the minister, to the member Georgetown West off the bat, that the number that we be looking for or looking at will definitely be, it won't be lower than the 600,000 mark, because we have already accepted that and recognized that, and that again has already been made public. So what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is directly not new. Equally, Mr. Speaker, we do recognize that while stamp duty is an issue, the bigger issue also, Mr. Speaker, is not the stamp duty that they pay on the land, but the actual cost of the land itself. And one of the things, Mr. Speaker, which I'm proud, and I'm going to ask my Minister of Land indulgence for an initiative that she has been working on, where government is actually right now already purchased land and is actually in the process of subdividing the land. And what I can honestly say, Mr. Speaker, and again, not to preempt, and I don't want to take any thunder from my ministerial colleague and someone who or speaks something I don't have constitutional responsibility for. But what I can say, based on the initial analysis that we have done in terms of even the land that we're subdividing, it is actually going to be a house lot more than, I think, quarter acre, or at least thereabouts. 10,000 square feet, thank you, Minister. And the initial price point is easily going to be less than $50,000 for that land. So these are the kind of initiatives, Mr. Speaker, that we're working on. And equally, Mr. Speaker, touching the land issue, while stamp duty is an issue, what we also do have to recognize, Mr. Speaker, is that land prices itself is subject to market terms or the market principles of supply and demand. We recognize that the supply of land is limited. Simply put, the Cayman Islands land space is not growing unless you want to count the landfill. So when supply is limited and demand increases, automatically price will increase. So, Mr. Speaker, I say this to say, not only are we looking at just the price of land, we're looking at the things that causes the price of land. And whether we want to accept it or not, the part of this conversation that needs to happen is we also have to look at our immigration laws and what it is that we do require. Mr. Speaker, we have a current PR system that is also being reviewed, especially on the point system, where it is almost mathematically impossible to qualify for PR without owning real estate. You cannot reasonably expect to have 500, 600, 700 people every year applying for PR, where they're going out and putting a demand on property that is not growing, and do not expect the price to go up. So we just can't look at the stamp duty alone, Mr. Speaker. We also have to look at the factors that drive up the cost of land. And then, Mr. Speaker, there's also the issue of land banking, where people have actually gone out and just buying large swaths of land to just sit on and waiting on development to reach. So there are a lot of different factors. And for every year, Mr. Speaker, as more properties come off the market from people buying it, it means that there are less property available, or the supply has been reduced within the frame. And then when the demand continues to increase, it continues to drive up the price. So the stamp duty itself, Mr. Speaker, is only one symptom of it. The bigger issue itself is land prices in Cayman. Now, we have seen other countries take a radical approach, and quite recently, everyone saw what Canada did in terms of limiting foreigners in buying land and so forth. Canada, Mr. Speaker, by square miles or whatever, is the second largest country on this planet. Only country larger than I believe is Russia, within its size. And of course, it is very easy to take an approach where you try to appease people very quickly, because there are a lot of people are ticked off. You read the Canadian news, a lot of Asian people coming in, buying a property, and people going crazy, and the politicians felt as if though this was the right thing to do to appease the crowd and all that kind of stuff. But we also do recognize in the Cayman Islands that we don't have the luxury that Canada have, nor many other countries have. So any decisions that we're taking as a government, it has to be holistic. Because at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, I remember when one of the first bills we brought here was even on the making some changes to the immigration law, vaccination. And the amount of people that went up in arms in terms of us felt as if we were targeting one group, this group, or whatever. We have to recognize, Mr. Speaker, that there's a lot of people in Cayman that also rely on development. So whatever it is that the government can do to actually encourage development, sustainable development, I might add, responsible development, is something that we'll be looking at. Equally, Mr. Speaker, the government recognizes, and all of us in this House recognizes, and we have learned this from a very early age, that three of the basic things that people need is food, clothing, and shelter. Now, earlier today, I think we had around 4.5 hours to consume as much food as we can in terms of that long lunch break. So I think for today, we should be fine from a food standpoint. Clothing, we're all dressed. But when it comes on to shelter, Mr. Speaker, shelter itself is a basic human right. Housing is a basic human right. And I say that to say that regardless of how much money or revenues that government need, stamp duty that government can collect cannot come at the expense of denying Caymanians the right to own a place to seek shelter. I say that to say that thus far, when I look at the amount of exceptions that have been exercised by this government, and one of the things I want to add, Mr. Speaker, is that in most cases, we discuss even the waivers outside the normal at a caucus level to make sure that we don't set a precedent. So if something is outside the boundary, we'll take it to the group, we'll discuss it. And every single time, Mr. Speaker, that I've taken that exception to my caucus, they have all supported giving the stamp duty. Just this year alone, Mr. Speaker, up to the period up to April, is 24 different exceptions that we have already approved to help Caymanian families based on the current system that is there. That's all right. So it is not something, Mr. Speaker, that for us this is a no-brainer in terms of accepting it. But, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that we need to be conscious of is that this government is committed to ensuring that Caymanians get a piece of the rock. But equally, as I said before, we have to look at other factors to take into consideration to make sure that it's not just the stamp duty that we're waiving, but also the cost of land itself. And it is that holistic picture. So I can honestly say to the member from Georgetown West, we wholeheartedly can easily consider this. We've already looked at it, and I can say I think you're going to be pleased with the end result, because what is going to be proposed is actually going to be thank you, Minister, for clarifying. what is actually going to be proposed is going to be, as far as going to exceed this amount, because we do recognize that this is a challenge. And I am pleased to state, and I guess since the minister handed me the note, what I can say is that the first land initiative that we're looking at to help Caymanians in terms of purchasing their homes is actually in the district of East End, where that land right now is actually the process of subdivision have already started. And the note that the minister just passed to me is that those house lot, 10,000 square feet, is going to be between $25,000 to $30,000 once they meet certain criteria for our people. And this is an initiative that we intend to roll out across all 3 islands, because we do recognize that our people need to own a piece of the rock. And if there's one entity that can actually afford at this point to purchase land to make sure our people actually get the prices, it is actually the people's money at this point. So wherever possible, and I'm sure you guys would see the weekly cabinet notes that come out, and just about every single one, there is a land purchase on it where we're going through. One of the things that I also want to take, and I hope I'm not going to take and overstep my boundaries constitutionally, but when you look at the UN goal for sustainability, one of them is about having at least 30% of land preserved by 2030. We are not halfway there yet, but it is the hope of this government that during the term that we can at least bit by bit get closer to that goal of making sure that we have sufficient land set aside for our people. Because, Mr. Speaker, whether we want to accept it or not, next year I'm 50. I can go back to what it is that, for some people, I can go back to what it is where Cayman was like in the 70s, the 80s, and even the 90s. But the reality of it is the Cayman of today that we all have to live in. And I don't worry about the past, I worry about the future. And as one of the first lessons that I learned from the member for Red Bay, very early on, he said to me, "Why are you following them guys over there? You know, there's no future in the past." And I've always remembered that lesson. So, Mr. Speaker, I say that to say this. We live in a country where we always try our best to make our parents proud. But at the end of the day, it is not our parents that are going to inherit what it is that we do. It's going to be our children. And that's the reason I said in my Mother's Day message, we should start focusing more on making our children proud than our parents, because they're the ones who are going to inherit what it is that we do. And in the end, Mr. Speaker, we're not going to be remembered for what we inherited, but we're going to be remembered for what we leave behind. And where this government is concerned, what we want to leave behind is a Cayman where every Caymanian has the opportunity to live their best life. Every Caymanian has the opportunity to own a piece of the rock. And while we cannot guarantee equal outcome for everyone, what we can fight for, Mr. Speaker, is equal opportunity. So I can say to the member for Georgetown West, the committee has already started its own work at an individual level. My Ministry of Finance have already started the work. We have the data from the census that we're also analyzing as it comes up bit by bit. And I can say that this motion is pretty much a no-brainer for the government, simply because what is being proposed there is actually going to be better in the final analysis based on the preliminary analysis that we have right now. So with that, Mr. Speaker, we can accept the motion. And I also want to thank the member for Georgetown West for bringing this issue up, and also to remind the Caymanian people that this is something that is not political, because this is something that we all agree with and we all support. And I welcome him at least for bringing it back to the forefront to let everyone know that every member of this House is concerned about the cost of land and also the stamp duty that is payable. But as I said before, shelter itself, housing itself, is a basic human right. And it cannot come at the expense of government finances to deny people an opportunity to own a piece of the rock and have some place for their families to live. With that, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member again. The government will accept the motion, and I would be more than happy to meet with the member to kind of show him also some of the work that we have done and how we came up with the the initiatives that we have. I just want to really thank the board of CIDB, Mr. Speaker. I really want to go there because the rate that CIDB has offered is 3.75% fixed for the next 2 years. And when the Fed next meet, there's a very strong possibility that the prime rate is going to go up. And the rate that is being offered by CIDB right now will actually be below the prime rate. Do we have enough money to rival the mortgage portfolio of the large banks? No. But for what we do have, we're making the best of it. And I am hoping that many of the banks out there will sit back and say, you know what? If we can afford to at least keep rates fixed at 3.75% for the next 2 years and offer homeowners some relief and also some certainty during these challenging times, we're open to other banks will follow suit. And I just want to kind of close, Mr. Speaker, on another issue that while I had mentioned my quote-unquote radical idea on the campaign trail, one of the things that we have to really consider, and I've already met with the CEO of the stock exchange, Mr. Archer, in terms of looking at the mechanism that we can to create a capital markets in Cayman. And the reason why that is important, Mr. Speaker, is we have seen instances in the United States where even when the Fed rate goes up, the actual mortgage rates actually decrease. And the reason being is that their mortgages are actually backed by their bond market and not basically money from overnight. The challenge that we have here in Cayman, Mr. Speaker, is that nobody or no bank has an offering where people are putting out 10, 15, 20, 25-year, 30-year deposits. So banks, in essence, are taking overnight money, which is liquid, cash is liquid, converting it to a 25, 30-year mortgage, which is illiquid, and then basically take on what they refer to as a liquidity risk. That risk comes at a cost. And as a result, it also continues to drive up, it drives up the cost of borrowing. Because now if we can get a bond market in place where we can have steady money, and that's why some people sit down and beg for the pension money to come back, because that may be a source of longer money as opposed to even overnight money. Some banks may go as much as 5 years fixed, but the truth of the fact is we do need the mechanism to start having 20, 25, 30-year fixed from that standpoint to actually have some level of certainty and some level of stability inside the market. What we can't have, Mr. Speaker, is what we're going to probably experience this year, where there's a possibility that mortgage rates will be increased by about 2%, which would be a substantial amount for some families by the time the Fed have all of these different meetings in which to try to control inflation that is in the US. So for us to continue this as a community, it was fine when we were much smaller, but as we're getting more bigger and the portfolio is getting bigger, we need to start looking at other mechanisms to make sure that we have longer term money to basically assist our people. And that is one of the things that we're hoping, at least we have already had initial meetings with some individuals within the financial sector to see what it is that we can do in terms of creating this capital market that will allow not just homeowners to have longer access to longer term money, but also even for farmers, Mr. Speaker, in the sense that, you know, we need the kind of approach where we can make the real investments needed. So you take a farmer, for example, Mr. Speaker, where there's no, you can lend a farmer money today to go develop something and expect him to start paying it back in 6 months. The crops are not going to grow, it's just not going to be ready. You know, you need loans where they can go at least 3 years with no payment, then maybe the next 2 years is interest only, and then 5 years after that they're paying interest and principal. This is the kind of market that we'll need to create if we're truly serious about really creating opportunities for our people, and also then to start limiting the shocks that we have on our local economy from outside forces. As the member for Georgetown West rightly said, the amount of levers currently available to us are limited. And now it is incumbent on all of us in this House to start putting other levers in place to at least limit these shocks. We may not stop many of them, but at least to limit the shocks. I know the Premier has been working with his ministry in terms of even increasing the amount of renewables that we have on island, to be shipping off $150, $200 million a year just to bring fuel in, when we should be looking at other ways to keep that money here and have some level of price stability and certainty in the market is one of the things that we're focusing on. So I know I've kind of deviated a little bit on all of that, Mr. Speaker, but I think it was important for all the members of this House to understand where the government is going holistically, and not just on this one issue, but on this issue, I think we're all in agreement. And again, I want to thank the member for Georgetown West for bringing it, highlighting it, and at least putting it back in the public domain to remind people how important this one issue is. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you, and again, let the opposition know that this motion will receive the unanimous support of all members in this House. I'm assuming that your colleagues also support it, but I can speak for my colleagues on this side. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, I'll call on the member for Georgetown South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to give a brief contribution to the motion brought by my colleague and the member for Georgetown West. A motion that seeks to make it a bit easier for Caymanians to buy property or a home, especially young Caymanian families buying their very first home or a piece of land. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and I know the impact of the rising costs of living, including housing, on my own family. Every time I fill up my car with gas, when I buy groceries or pay for my utilities, I see it for myself. I'm also close to my constituents, and I know how hard many of our people are having it right now to make ends meet and to afford rent or a mortgage. So, Mr. Speaker, I know we all understand the financial pressures facing our people. We all understand the need to provide increased assistance for Caymanians looking to buy a home or a piece of land. Home ownership is not only an aspiration for many Caymanians, but I firmly believe that home ownership helps to build and make our communities stronger. For many families, including single mothers, home ownership brings with it security for their family. When we get older, owning the roof over our heads gives us peace of mind and allows us to leave something for our children and our grandchildren. For as far back as I can remember, Mr. Speaker, I understood the importance of home ownership for Caymanians. Like many of your fathers, my own father went to sea and sent money home to support us, but to also save to start our home. That home still stands on Crew Road, Mr. Speaker, as a testament to my parents' dreams and the security that home provided to our family. As the years went by and our family grew, my parents added to their house. That was the way it was back then. Times were simpler then, Mr. Speaker. Land was plentiful, and families were able to help each other. But even with the passage of time, home ownership is still very much a part of the Caymanian dream. This is not a politically partisan motion, Mr. Speaker. This is a motion that everyone here can and should get behind. And I'm so pleased to hear the Deputy Premier say that the government will be supporting this motion. My colleague, the member for Georgetown West, has done an excellent job moving the motion and outlining its rationale. As such, I do not intend to speak for long. However, I want to emphasize the point he raised that we are facing a cost of living crisis, including increased housing costs that is expected to worsen before it gets better. There's no denying that world events have made the cost of living much worse, and this has dramatically impacted the cost of home ownership. As the member for Georgetown West has said, this is not a problem caused by the government, but it is a problem that the government needs to address. And I said earlier, I'm very pleased to hear that they are addressing the issue, and we're all on the same page here. The cost of almost everything from food, fuel, utilities, and housing, whether renting or buying a home, has risen far more than our wages can cope. Some in our islands will feel the pinch of increasing cost, but will manage okay. But there are more who will feel far more than a pinch and are struggling. We are not alone in this, Mr. Speaker. As anyone who pays attention to world news would understand, last month, the UK government passed a £15.3 billion package of benefits to help their citizens survive this crisis. We are not the UK, Mr. Speaker, but we may not be able to do what they are doing, but we must do what we can. And reducing the tax burden for Caymanians looking to purchase a home or a piece of land is within our ability. And this is what this motion is seeking to do. We are trying to recover from the pandemic as a country, but the headwinds are strong and unpredictable. And so our recovery will also be slow and unpredictable. Fortunately, the economic policies and financial buffers put in place by the previous government that I was a part of are still benefiting the economy and our people. I remember the many times in caucus when we discussed the importance of preparing for the next economic downturn. We did not know when it would be, or what it would be, or how hard it would hit, but we knew it would come. We had to have the country prepared fiscally and with as sound an economy as possible to allow the private sector to recover. And so, Mr. Speaker, we held fast to our financial plan to grow the economy, create surpluses, pay our way with the cash we had whilst paying down debt and taking on no new borrowing and putting aside money for the rainy day that we knew would come. And yes, Mr. Speaker, we also did not increase government fees and duties and reduce them where we could do so. But we did increase assistance to many who needed it despite a buoyant economy. Today's cost of living and housing crisis is also a time when we need to provide much needed assistance to our people. So I join with my colleague to anticipate the unanimous support of this motion. Before sitting down, I wish to note that the crux of this motion is not new for us, as it is referenced in the Progressives Manifesto on page 19, in a section titled, Tackling the Increasing Cost of Living, including options for housing. I sincerely believe that this motion and the other ideas we propose in our manifesto are worthy of consideration by the government. Good ideas do not have an owner, Mr. Speaker. And so, as I have said, I hope the government will vote with us to pass this motion, and in so doing, help our people. As my colleague noted, however, many more needs to be done. This motion is a necessary part of the mix, and so too is creating more affordable housing. Just as we did during the last term, the government of the day plans for the National Housing Development Trust to build more government affordable homes. but not everyone can qualify for these homes, and government can't build them fast enough to fill the need. We must also incentivize private sector to join in this effort, and the member for Georgetown North, together with the civil service, had started to look into various options prior to the pandemic. The work and the report done then is still available, and I urge the minister responsible for housing or the deputy premier to seek it out, dust it off, and restart the work of the now defunct committee who are looking into affordable housing. So perhaps that report can also be a part of the discussion for your committee, Deputy Premier. And of course, we also needed to assist Caymanians across the home and land prices spectrum to be able to afford a home. That is why we are proposing an increase in the cap available for the first-time Caymanian home buyers who will pay no duty up to $500,000. And I'm so happy to know that you've increased it, or you all will propose increasing it to $600,000, as well as allowing 2% duty on amounts above that. For Caymanians who do not qualify for the first-time home buyer programs, then the duty payable is proposed to be 5%. These changes will make a significant difference, especially as the cost of land and homes are rising, and many Caymanians, especially young Caymanians, are being priced out of the market. The effect of rising prices, property prices, is that over time, more Caymanians are becoming longer-term renters than they are homeowners. If you agree that home ownership makes for stronger communities, then this is a trend that we must find a way to fix. This motion is one solution to the problem, Mr. Speaker, but it is a financially meaningful one for all Caymanians. So with this short contribution, I again commend this motion to the House, and I'm so happy to hear that all the honourable members across the floor will be supporting this motion, and thus improve opportunities for Caymanian homeowners. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, I'll call on the mover for his right of reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to be very brief and just thank the Deputy Premier for his contribution on the motion. And it was encouraging, as the member from Georgetown South said, to hear that we will get the support from the government. And it's also encouraging to hear that they plan with the committee that they formed to improve on our proposals. But Mr. Speaker, I also just want to say that every caucus that we go to, our opposition caucus, when we have our caucus, I can see the pain and the hurt in the faces of our members whenever we get together and talk about the cost of living crisis that the people of Cayman are facing. And as we say, there's more to be done in other areas, but just to get it going and to try give relief and release some hardship on Caymanians, this was the first motion that we decided that we would do. And I just want to thank my colleagues for helping me put this together. And I know that this is not the end of what we plan, because every caucus we have, we get together and we try to solve the problems we see facing the people of Cayman with this very, very important issue that we have, the cost of living crisis. And with that, I would just like to thank the House for their support, or their intended support. Thank you.
Just want to say that for members' information, that it's about 29 years ago, the first motion, such motion, was brought by the government at that time. And Probably. But I am just happy that we could have this kind of consensus, because if you look back then, you would see the beating I took for trying to do the same thing. Question is, be therefore resolved that the government consider as a matter of urgency amending the Stamp Duty Act as follows. For first-time Caymanian property and home buyers, A, zero duty on land only with a value of up to $200,000, and for houses, apartments, or other dwelling purchases with a market value of up to $500,000 for owner occupations, and B, 2% duty on the value above $200,000 on land purchases, and for houses, apartments, or other dwelling purchased for owner occupation on the value above $500,000. C, in cases where the property is transferred to 2 or not more than 10 persons who are first-time Caymanian homeowners, 1, zero duty for bare land purchases and a market value of up to $350,000, and houses, apartments, or other dwelling purchases with a market value of up to $600,000 for owner occupation, and 2% duty on the value about $350,000 on raw land purchases, and for houses, apartments, or other dwellings purchased for owner occupation on the value about $600,000. For property purchased by a Caymanian that does not fall into the first-time Caymanian property or home buyers scheme, the 5% stamp duty for Caymanian persons only. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. Motion number 4 has been passed. Before we take the note or the vote for the adjournment, leave has been given to the Leader of the Opposition to raise a public matter. I call on the member for Georgetown East, the Honorable the Leader of the Opposition. He has 20 minutes to raise the matter, and no one else speaks. A member of government will answer, and no one else speaks. No? Public interest, public matter. That's what my speaker's note says. Before we take the adjournment, the vote, before we take the vote for the adjournment. So, Honorable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, well, we know what's coming. So, Mr. Speaker, I rise to formally move the adjournment of this Honourable House until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
And as I said, leave has been given to the member from Georgetown East, the leader of the opposition, to raise a matter which he will speak to and no one else will speak on that side, and a member of government will answer and no one else will speak on the matter. The leader of the opposition.
Thank you very much,
20 minutes.
Speaker. You rightly say I have 20 minutes. I can promise you I won't be taking that long. No, I don't think I need that. Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for accepting my request this afternoon for permission to raise an urgent matter of public importance for which the Premier and his government have responsibility, and to elicit a response from a member of the government responsible for the matter. Mr. Speaker, the onset of the COVID pandemic of 2020 has wreaked havoc on world economies, decimating many countries. 2.5 years later, the world continues to grapple with the pandemic and the economic fallout from it. In the Cayman Islands, we have seen severe impacts on our economy, with the closure of our borders to tourism for many months. Collateral fallout from the pandemic has evidenced itself in the form of significant disruption to the supply chains for all sorts of raw materials and finished goods, making it harder and more expensive for economies to function efficiently and effectively, including our own. Now, for the past 3 months and continuing, the world is contending with the war in Ukraine and the impending shortages in food, particularly grain and other raw materials, further adding to the misery. I might add today, Mr. Speaker, that the World Health Organization is warning now of serious food shortages as a result of what's taking place. The result is that all these disruptions and shortages are driving prices higher in literally every sphere of economic activity. In the United States, where the annual inflation is reported to have been 7.04% in 2021 and running at an annual rate of 8.26% through the end of April 2022, it has resulted in the Federal Reserve embarking on an aggressive course of raising interest rates in an effort to curb consumer demand and bring inflation under control. Mr. Speaker, it is worth noting that the rates of inflation that the U.S. and indeed the Cayman Islands are experiencing are the highest seen in more than 40 years. You've got to go back to the late 1970s and early 1980s to find a time when inflation was this high. Here in Cayman, nowhere is the rampant inflation more evident than at the grocery stores and at the gas pump, where prices for gasoline topped $7 per gallon last week for the first time in our history and are likely to go substantially higher. It is not unheard of for motorists to now pay more than $100 to fill up a car these days. In response to the Federal Reserve's actions, local banks are also raising their interest rates for all forms of lending, making it more expensive for Caymanians to borrow, and in almost all cases, extending the life of home mortgages as more of borrowers' monthly payments are going to pay interest rather than principal. Mr. Speaker, what really brought this to a head for me was the release yesterday of the ESO's Consumer Price Index report, January to March 2022, and the Premier's remarks made yesterday also at the RF Economic Outlook Conference. Mr. Speaker, the ESO reported that the Consumer Price Index increased by 11.2% in the first quarter of 2022 when compared to the same period in 2021. And for the first time that I can recall, every division in the CPI basket showed increases in average prices. Mr. Speaker, I think it bears repeating, because my colleague did mention it in his contribution in the private member's motion that we just debated. But it also bears repeating, and I will read them briefly here. The increases Housing and utilities, the division has shown a 20.1% increase, as the cost of electricity had a 35% increase. Transportation index for this division has increased by 15.7%. Clothing and footwear, the division showed an 8% increase as the cost of footwear and clothing purchased abroad rose by 28% and 3.8% respectively. Furnishings and household equipment and routine household maintenance, 7.2% increase in the division's index, traced mainly to household textiles, showing a 34.1% increase. Food and non-alcoholic beverages, the division showed a 4.9% increase in the average prices of meat and products, and fruit rose by 13.8% and 11.9%. Restaurants and hotels, the index for this division recorded a 4.3% increase. Communication showed a 3.7% increase as the cost of telephone and telefax services rose by 5%. Miscellaneous goods and services up by 2.1%. Alcohol and beverages up by 2.1%. Recreation and culture up by 2%. Education up by 1.2%. And health, an overall increase of 0.2%, being the lowest division in the basket to show increases. But Mr. Speaker, all of them showing, with that one exception, showing fairly substantial increases. And Mr. Speaker, economists are telling us that inflation is not going away anytime soon. While predictions vary, it seems clear that it is unlikely that there will be any meaningful relief before the end of 2022 and possibly well into 2023. Warning bells that the U.S. economy is likely to go into recession next year are ringing louder and louder and becoming more frequent. And stagflation, first time I'm hearing this in many decades, which is high inflation with low or no growth, is a growing concern. And that is a disaster for any economy. Mr. Speaker, all these things are having a very serious impact on Caymanians, who have found out very quickly that their hard-earned dollars simply do not buy what they could last year. And they are struggling to cope with the reduced purchasing power of their dollars. Higher prices for groceries, utilities, housing, transportation, and clothing, all things that we consider essential to our well-being in Cayman, are the areas where the ESO report indicates the highest inflationary impacts. Our people are in a crisis. Some of those, Mr. Speaker, who are hit the hardest by rising prices of essential items are our pensioners on fixed incomes with little to no ability to earn additional income, and are therefore largely affected by the reduction in the purchasing power of their dollar. They are hurting especially hard, and many are already starting and having to make decisions about whether to buy necessary medicines or the same types and quantities of food that they are accustomed to. Mr. Speaker, throughout these challenges, we have yet to hear from the government on what their thinking is, let alone what their plans are. I came to this meeting of Parliament with the full expectation that the Premier would deliver a statement to this honourable Parliament on this matter. I am disappointed that the Premier has not found it fit to do so. Mr. Speaker, as I sat here today preparing and thinking about what could Cayman do, I identified a number of things that the government could consider in terms of ways and means in which we could give help and render assistance to our people to help them through. Mr. Speaker, I'll just take a few minutes to share these with you. These are my personal views, And I do this from my experience and time there as former Minister of Finance, and also coming out of my background as well in financial services for all of my working life. But Mr. Speaker, if whatever government is considering, I would suggest that they look at doing things that will be helpful to all citizens. Most importantly, it is most important that everyone benefits from whatever you intend to do in terms of giving assistance to the public. Things that you might consider are a reduction in the duties on gasoline and diesel, even if it is only for a short time period, so at least at the end of the year. And then see where we get to. Is inflation coming down? Is the economy continuing to expand? Evaluate it as you go along. So let's suggest that we reduce duties on gasoline and diesel through to the end of the year. I would highly recommend that they defer the reinstatement of pension contributions scheduled to come in at the end of June and extend it now to the end of December. Every working person benefits from that. Every family, every person will benefit from a reduction in gasoline and diesel if we reduce the taxes. Then I would urge that you consider increases in the stipends paid to seamen, veterans, and those who are totally dependent on financial assistance from government. Fourth, I would urge you to consider, if it isn't already happening, I would urge you to consider a COLA for all the public service. If those talks aren't happening, they certainly are going to come. I repeat it at the insistence of my colleague, consider a COLA for all the public service. Fifth, consider a continuation of the COVID stipends. Mr. Speaker, I'm not suggesting that every one of these suggestions can be implemented or accepted. I give them and I offer them to the government as examples of what could be done. And I hope that they will give them due consideration. Mr. Speaker, I'm determined not to let this session of Parliament end without hearing from the Premier or some other member of the government on this matter. And so, Mr. Speaker, I do conclude my presentation this evening, and I ask the question, Premier, please tell us what your government's thoughts and plans are to provide meaningful relief from the rampant inflation and associated high cost of living that Caymanians are continuing to experience. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honorable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I only wish the member, the leader, honorable leader of the opposition, had brought a motion to deal with this issue in the way the others have been brought. Mr. Speaker, I found it interesting that during his term as Minister for Finance, the rate of inflation was in the region of 8+%, and nothing. I feel like picking this up, putting it up here. The rate of inflation was in the region of 8%, and nothing had been done at that time. But he does understand the challenges.
Are you rising on a point of order?
Yes, sir. And
What's the point of order?
Mr. Speaker, he says it was in the region. Mr. Speaker, I got the ESO figures right here, so I can share them for the benefit of the Premier and the House. And the final quarter of the year 2019, it did peak at 8.4%, but dropped precipitously to 3% in the quarter after, in March 2020. So yes, it was rising in the first half of for 3 quarters in 2019, but dropped precipitously down to 3% in 2020 and lower.
Point of explanation. Honorable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I thank the member, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, for clarifying exactly what the rate of inflation was at the time. And yes, as he pointed out in comments earlier today, COVID has had a very significant impact on the country during the period of time that the country was in lockdown. There was some 5-point-something%. I don't have the exact number here because obviously I'm not prepared to respond to this in the same way he has been, not having any prior notice of it. But there was somewhere in the region of about a 5.5, let's say, thereabouts % decrease in economic growth, which is a reflection of a reduction in inflation as well, because obviously demand would have gone down. But, Mr. Speaker, that has certainly changed as we moved into 2021. And the cost of goods and services have absolutely started to increase. As a result of the items that have been reflected in the comments by members on these earlier motions, the supply chain disruptions, the Ukraine war that has caused significant commodity price instability and volatility. But Mr. Speaker, before we even get to the Ukraine situation, which has been relevant for the past 3 months or so, a lot of these issues existed when this government got elected. It was clear to us that we were facing a scenario of significant inequalities. And while Cayman had this perception of being opulent and prosperous and great economic growth statistics prior to 2020, we understood the issues that existed because the people of the country told us what their concerns were. So we recognized that there were 2 parallel Caymans, Mr. Speaker. And we were determined to do something about it. This government understood from day one that there were concerns that needed to be addressed reflecting the interests of the people of this country. So, Mr. Speaker, we didn't wait until we had somebody tell us at a conference that cost of living was an issue and was going to be an issue. We didn't wait for an ESO report to tell us inflation was at 11.2% for the last quarter. We started taking action from the moment we got elected, Mr. Speaker. We have taken in the region of a dozen actions so far to help the people of this country, to help some of the most vulnerable people in our society, those in the lower and middle class, our senior citizens, our students. Mr. Speaker, I think I need to remind the members of some of the things that we have taken. But before I do that, let me just say, I know that the Honourable Leader of the Opposition absolutely understands the difficulties faced by any government in addressing inflation. We don't have a central bank in Cayman that we can assign monetary policy to. And as he apparently noted to his colleagues in their caucus discussions, there are very few tools available to this government. You know that, you know that yourself, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to trying to control inflation in the country, because as they have noted themselves in their discussion on the previous motion, it is imported. So there's very few levers, there's very few things we can do from a policy perspective to have an impact on the level of inflation. Mr. Speaker, one of the earlier motions asked us to utilize surplus funds to help fund a reduction in stamp duty. We supported that. We have been doing that, Mr. Speaker. We have been doing that. But given that we have very few tools, we have to, the one thing we can do, Mr. Speaker, is try to find ways to help the right people, target our resources where we are, our limited resources where we can, to help the most amount of people. And one of the things that we did, Mr. Speaker, which I think they have forgotten, but I'll say for the benefit of the members of the opposition and the listening public, we put in place very early on a program of free school lunches, breakfasts, and snacks for not only primary school, but into high school as well. Mr. Speaker, that cost the country in the range of $16.5 million. Now we have limited resources, but we recognize the challenges that our people were facing from last year, Mr. Speaker. We recognize that the supply chain disruptions were going to continue to have a negative impact on cause inflation to go up. But of course, nobody predicted the reality of a Ukraine war, a war in Europe. Who would have thought that that would actually occur in this day and age, Mr. Speaker? But it has. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? I am very happy that myself and my colleagues started doing the things that we did from then, because we started making a difference for the people of this country. from virtually the moment we got into office. We didn't wait on reports. We didn't wait on somebody else to tell us. We knew we had to start making a difference for them, because the Caymanians, those that were on the lesser side of the income levels, were hurting already, Mr. Speaker. So that saved, Mr. Speaker, hundreds of dollars a month in school lunches for Caymanian families. The average family has 2-point-something children. And again, I don't know the exact numbers, but it clearly has significantly helped our Caymanian families who would have difficulties finding money to take out from all the other expenses that they have, all the other increasing expenses. Mr. Speaker, we also looked at the end, that part of the spectrum, including our seniors. And we did driver's license reductions, I think car licensing reductions, passport application reductions. I think we reduced those by in the region of 50%. That's significant. Mr. Speaker, we didn't wait for anybody to tell us that. They are some of our most vulnerable people when it comes to increasing costs, because they generally have a fixed income. Mr. Speaker, we also went on and we removed duty on certain food items and essential family items. I think there was feminine care products and baby food products, baby products, carriers, these types of things, all designed, Mr. Speaker, to help our Caymanian families, because we knew that they were already suffering, and we knew that the rate of inflation was likely to continue to go up and impact them negatively. So we made it a commitment to, the Minister for Education talked about it earlier today, we made it a commitment to education. I know the members on the other side in the opposition are equally committed to education, but we stepped out there and said we are going to make sure that the children are fed, that they have the ability to learn in school, and their families can benefit from this financially. Mr. Speaker, of course, we continued with the stipend for the displaced tourism workers. We've continued with that. We have supported those members of our community who needed help. Of course, that's a continuing cost in addition to the new levels of spending that we have provided in order to help support our community. Mr. Speaker, we've also provided financial support to employees who had to quarantine, those who couldn't work, couldn't spend an hour working and get paid for it. We stood up and did what we had to do to help those people, Mr. Speaker. Now, I say that not to say that that addresses inflation, but it certainly is a cost to the country, which we were very happy to be able to incur to support those families. And unfortunately, the more we spend, the less we have to help support other areas that do relate to inflationary pressures. But we continue to try to get the balance right. Mr. Speaker, we have also provided financial support to small and medium-sized businesses. That's to help the local business owners, to help protect their assets that were deteriorating during lockdown, and they couldn't They couldn't maintain them, Mr. Speaker. We all know if a car isn't driven, it starts to deteriorate generally. Anything mechanical, particularly in this environment, Mr. Speaker. So we provided support to help small and medium-sized businesses to maintain their assets so that when tourism reopened and the economy started rolling again, they were in a position to start delivering services and participating and earning incomes and reestablishing their pride and being able to support their families, not having to rely on further assistance. Mr. Speaker, we also had another program to support the premium insurance payments to help people maintain their health insurance. Now, Mr. Speaker, the opposition did the same, I think. But the point is we continued programs to help people, plus we implemented additional new programs that all had significant costs to try to help our people. Mr. Speaker, we provided free masks, free lateral flow tests, free testing, all to help reduce the burden on our people. We reintroduced the primary school grants, Mr. Speaker, put it back up to $2 million, because we knew that if we helped those private schools, they would be able to grant scholarships to Caymanian students, helping them with their education, helping Caymanian families, Mr. Speaker. That, again, is a cost which we gladly bear in order to help our people. We increased the A-level scholarship funding to cover the full 2 years, Mr. Speaker. We increased the funding and the maximum amounts for both undergraduate and graduate scholarships. Mr. Speaker, I'm going through areas of expenditure that we have incurred to help families in this country, to help our people get an opportunity to progress, to help families with the burden of educating their children so that they have good opportunities in this country. Mr. Speaker, we even granted visa stipends, $1,500, I think it was per stipend for children to go get their visas. We have committed funding and policy space and effort and time with my colleague, the Minister for Housing. We have challenged him to get 100 houses, affordable houses done. All, Mr. Speaker, reflecting a commitment to the people of this country, to helping people in this country. Now, that I don't think was clearly even reflected in the previous this motion that we have been discussing. We have not laid off anybody, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have cared, and we understand the pain and we understand the suffering that our people have had. And it wasn't just today, it wasn't just since the opposition have started with their regular caucuses, Mr. Speaker. Our people have been suffering for some time. And we now have been doing a number of significant things to help them. We have been doing a number of significant things to help them, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I've been telling you about what has been done. But there are other things that we're planning to do as well. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition has taken leave of his chair. I wish he was sitting here continuing to listen, because he is the one that asked the question, what have you been doing? What are you planning to do? Well, I'm very grateful to the two members of the opposition who are still listening and present in their seats, Mr. Speaker, because I want the opposition and I want the people of the country to understand that we feel the same pain that they say that they see in the faces of their constituents. We're all Caymanians here, Mr. Speaker, and we care. I care about their constituents just as much as they care about their own too. And we seek to do whatever we can to help. Now, Mr. Speaker, I was in Parliament yesterday morning. I was not able to attend the REO conference in person. I regret that was the case, but I came through and I provided them with comments virtually. And one of the things I said there, Mr. Speaker, and if the Leader of the Opposition, Honourable Leader of the Opposition, listened to it, I presume he did, he would have heard me say that one of the things that keeps me up at night right now is the cost of living that our people are facing. Because we know what the challenges are, we understand them just as well as they do, Mr. Speaker. But at least we have been doing something for the past year. I've articulated a variety of things that we have been doing. I've had to obviously make some quick notes, but this is a reflection of a government that cares for our people, Mr. Speaker, and we have not dallied in taking action to help them. No, wherever they are, they can hear. I'm sure they have the speaker on. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've talked in summary about a number of the things that we've done, which reflects significant commitment of resources to this issue, benefits to our people on this issue. But, Mr. Speaker, we have other things that we've been working on as well. Do you really think, Mr. Speaker, I was going to go and give comments that I am worried about the cost of living in this country, and we haven't been trying to do something about it and planning to do more? I couldn't do that. I know exactly what the criticism would be. Mr. Speaker, we have been looking at this issue from last year. We've been working for months now on a variety of different additional initiatives that we are looking to roll out. Some of them are on the cusp of being rolled out. Mr. Speaker, I'm talking about things like expansion of offerings by Cynical. We have talked about that publicly. There's been a press release and a discussion of that, to offer more competitive products and services across the spectrum, including health and property insurance. Mr. Speaker, our aim is to try to drive down the costs of these types of contracts, these benefits that our people are going to get. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about another very important and significant initiative that we are taking on, that we're on the cusp of rolling out for the people of this country. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I'm talking about an initiative which will provide temporary assistance for residential electricity costs. We plan to set aside somewhere in the region of $5 to $6 million to help families with the increase in electricity costs, which are due to fuel cost increases. One thing is sure, Mr. Speaker, is even if we all consume the same amount of electricity, the price of fuel, the price of diesel has gone up. And that means that the cost overall to our constituents, customers of CUC. And Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear. I want to get right close to this microphone because I want the members of Cayman Brac to know as well, the people of Cayman Brac to know as well. And I'm getting here so I can look around at my colleague, the Minister for Education from Cayman Brac. We haven't forgotten Cayman Brac and Little Cayman. Mr. Speaker, I want to tell you, and I want the people of Cayman to know that we have been in discussions with the service providers to try to figure out exactly how we can best target the resources that we have available to help our people, because we know the cost, we know the pain that they're going to be suffering. We've already done a lot of stuff, but we know it's not enough. We continue to do. We continue to help support the people of this country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the customers of CUC that I think will be within the cohort, the number that I think will be in that cohort that we will be seeking to help is in the region of over 21,000 customers. And Mr. Speaker, based on discussions with Cayman Brac Power and Light Management, I'm not even sure who the discussions have been with, but it relates to Cayman Brac Power and Light customers. It's somewhere in the region of at least 600 of their customers that we are seeking to help. That's why we're not leaving them out.
Why didn't we run a report for that?
I'll tell you. I'll tell you later. I'm just saying, we are not leaving out the people of Cayman Brac. This is an attempt to help everybody as far as we can. Of course, a Little Cayman too. No, we're not leaving them out. Sister Islands. But we know, Mr. Speaker, that not everybody needs the help. Mr. Speaker, some of us gave constituents Christmas presents of, that we thought needed vouchers from CUC or something, and those that didn't need it gave it on to friends that they knew needed it. So we know the need is there. We know the need is there, Mr. Speaker. And we are not ignoring those issues, and I don't have to rely on anybody. This government does not have to rely on anybody to watch a video, listen to remarks, and tell us that we need to help the people. And yes, Mr. Speaker, I will say that we have been in discussions with the Deputy Governor, and there will be a COLA for civil servants. Mr. Speaker, I know members will recall the Honorable Deputy Governor speaking about the approach to addressing cost of living increases for members in the civil service. And I know that members will recall that he has previously advised this House that it was going to be, that they had done this initially in 2020, addressing issues around the upper level of the scale, and now they needed to face and address the issues with the lower levels of the scale. Mr. Speaker, I believe I'm correct in saying that this is the target, this is what is being addressed now.
Thank you, sir.
Now we will come in with, we'll be able to provide more information subsequently, shortly, Mr. Speaker. But this is going to help a significant number of our middle class, Mr. Speaker. Those people that are most impacted. Mr. Speaker, we know we have a system of revenue in this country which is regressive in the sense that it impacts those on the lower levels of income greater than those on the higher levels of income. That is why we have, as a principle, an approach which is designed to try to help those people on the lower scales. Try to make sure that they're not left out. And I congratulate the Deputy Governor for his perspective in making sure that that is reflected in any COLA for the civil service. Mr. Speaker, we know the civil service is the largest employer in Cayman. Mr. Speaker, my colleague, the minister, in his response to the previous motion on stamp duty, a stamp duty scale in respect of housing, noted the CIDB initiative, the program, which has mortgages available, which are at a fixed rate of 3.75%. That is 25 basis points right now, Mr. Speaker, below prime rate. And most people in Cayman can't afford to get a mortgage at prime. It's always prime plus something. So this, Mr. Speaker, is a program that will help provide real assistance to our people as well. Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons I talked about cost of living and my concerns around that in the context of the conference yesterday morning was to note that we have a policy initiative now. This government has a policy initiative now to pursue renewable energy as quickly as we can in the country. Mr. Speaker, we adopted a national energy policy in 2017, which set a target of 70% renewable energy by 2037, 15 years from now. Mr. Speaker, we're only at 3.3%. So we have to accelerate this. Not only, Mr. Speaker, does it need to be accelerated from an environmental perspective. I'm going to be a few more minutes, Mr. Speaker. I don't want to keep members much longer. But I think it's important to say these things. We are going to pursue renewable energy as quickly as possible. Again, not just because of the environmental benefit, but, Mr. Speaker, because it also helps, it will help to lower our cost of energy, and it will stabilize our cost of energy in this country. So the volatility that's brought about by extraneous geopolitical matters like wars and other conflicts, they are going to impact us less, Mr. Speaker. And our people are going to benefit more from that. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned the 100 homes already. My colleague, the Deputy Premier, talked about having discussions with local banks to try to help improve lending terms. There'll probably be some benefit to that, and any benefit right now, especially if it doesn't cost us anything, Mr. Speaker, is good. So any energy that we can put into to something to produce a benefit for our people, it is well spent time and energy. Mr. Speaker, no doubt down the road we may also have, if we continue to have relatively high inflation or high inflation, we and the U.S. Federal Reserve continues to push up rates by 50 basis points as they have indicated they plan to do over the rest of this year. I don't know, I think there's one meeting shortly and then one later on in the year. So we might have as much as a 1% increase. We might have a 5% prime rate, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that we need to do, and an initiative that we are taking forward and we'll be bringing to this Honourable House fairly soon, Mr. Speaker, is a reform of what we can generally call foreclosure provisions to again help assist anybody who is involved or caught in that unfortunate situation. That is going to benefit these people, Mr. Speaker. The one thing that helps people in that situation is time and the ability to have dialogue with the bank in order to help address their problems. This is going to provide that, both of them, Mr. Speaker. We're also working with farmers to help address the food security issues and help increase local production. So, Mr. Speaker, we're looking to do whatever we can to help to lower the cost of food, improve our food security by sourcing from regional markets. We acted quickly, Mr. Speaker, early on in this administration, and we have continued to act, Mr. Speaker. So when the member, the honourable leader of the opposition says he'd like to hear what we're doing, I've told him what we have done. And I've also given him a flavor of the things we are doing, Mr. Speaker. And I hope that he can appreciate, and I know he understands the challenges. We all do. We all do, Mr. Speaker. We all do. Everything, every little thing we can find to help. I mean, one of the very first things I remember within a week or two of being in office, the construction industry came along and said, we're out of cement. We're gonna have to lay off workers because we only have one source of cement. So we acted to address that, Mr. Speaker. So we have done a multitude of things in a range of different areas to help the economy, to help our people, to help industries help our people. And we've done so many things, Mr. Speaker, to help reduce the impact directly on our Caymanian families, our people who have been relying on us, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to close in terms of the pension issue. Yes, that is obviously something that could be considered. But Mr. Speaker, we have, and I'm not saying this to say it won't be considered. I'm just saying this to say that these are the kinds of issues that we have to balance. We have had 2 years of no pension payments. We have had $10,000 plus 25% of the remainder removed by a lot of people. I think the calculations were somewhere around $400 plus million that were taken out of the pension accounts of by Caymanians. And yes, it did help. It has helped. And I'm not second guessing and I'm not questioning the judgment decision of the government at that time. What has to be considered, though, Mr. Speaker, is are we creating long-term pain for our people just trying to address an issue right now in relation to the current situation with inflation, when we have all these other approaches that we're utilizing to try to address this? Mr. Speaker, I think the Leader of the Opposition noted that there are a range of opinions. Mr. Speaker, I've heard opinions ranging from inflation is going to continue for a significant period of time, years perhaps. I've heard the same discussions about the potential for stagflation as occurred back in the 1970s. Mr. Speaker, I have also heard many people talking more recently now about the potential that this may actually reverse. We may actually end up, particularly in the US, with a recession being triggered. The argument is that there are many central banks around the world who have been engaged in some degrees of tightening. So the argument is the Fed the US Federal Reserve has been a little bit late to the party and moving a little bit too aggressively. And perhaps that is going to trigger a recession. Mr. Speaker, I say that only to say that these are all potentials that we all have to be cognizant of when we're making decisions to try to help. We have to have these things in mind, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I think I have clearly outlined the benefits that and the resources we have applied to help the people of this country. And I hope that the Honourable Leader of the Opposition can admit that there are significant initiatives and actions that we have taken and are going to take or about to take, as I've outlined. The people can put that in the bank, sir. We are moving forward with these proposals, these initiatives, or these plans to help address this specific issue. So, Mr. Speaker, I thank you. I thank the members, my colleagues. I thought it was important to at least provide an outline of what we are doing. And Mr. Speaker, I intend to provide a more fulsome reflection of the details, plus other initiatives that I haven't even bothered to outline right now. So there's a lot more that we're looking to do, Mr. Speaker, and we're trying to get the balance right, and we're trying to do this for the people of this country, for our families, our friends, our constituents, and those of the members of the opposition as well. Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
The question is that the Honourable House do now adjourn until tomorrow, Friday, the 10th June at 10 a.m. Are you coming back tomorrow? No? At 10 a.m.? Tomorrow, 10 a.m., correct? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. This honorable House now stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.